as a COO, you have to remove obstacles. That's the position you've got to be in. I find a lot of these smaller companies, especially as they're scaling fast, they're hiring people to solve problems rather than getting to the root of the problem.
Sometimes, sales is like, hey, we want to go create something. And you're like, you shouldn't do that. That should not be your role.
One of the biggest chores of running a business is having the discipline to pick one and stick to it and be serious about it.
Mindset you got to have is not document everything, but document the major steps that get you the major results. Keep it simple, stupid.
Welcome to another episode of the NextGen Strategies podcast. We have a great guest today, Mr. Forrest Derr. Forrest is a Fractional Chief Operating Officer, and what I'll do is kind of not talk too much about Forrest and let him introduce himself, but we found this to be a really good topic because Forrest knows a lot about, the operations of a business and how it touches the different areas of your business. And I think it's a really nice topic for our listeners who are thinking about how things operate in their business and how they're going to get to the next level and scale. So I will kick it over to you, Forrest, if you want to jump in and give us an intro.
Appreciate it. So my name is Forrest Derr, not Forrester. A lot of people say Forrest Derr, and I have to spell my name out so they know, but it just happened yesterday, actually. So my name is Forrest Derr. I'm an COO, fractional COO / integrator. If you're an EOS fan, then you'll know the integrator term. If you're not EOS, you'll know COO term. But my goal is to come into businesses and work in those businesses with the business owners and leadership team to identify and elevate a replacement COO integrator up for myself and basically exit out of the business and train and coach that person into that spot, whether we hire them externally or internally. And help the leadership team and visionary get the business structured with people, process, and structure, marketing, sales, finance, so that the business owner can stop answering the phone. I think that's one of my biggest plays at this point is how do I get a business owner's phone to stop ringing so they can actually go on vacation. So that's what I do.
Oh, that's great. So you're seeing most of the time, I guess the question is, when you're finding a business to work with, do they tend to already have a CEO, or not CEO, COO who is leaving, or if they have had one that's left basically and they're kind of in a bind?
Yeah, so the three that I'm working with right now, two of them had a COO identified, but wasn't ready for that position. So they're sitting in a couple of different seats. And so two of those companies I'm working on getting them out of the other seats that they're in and getting them set up for success to understand what that COO role is, and then also putting the finances, processes, marketing processes, operations, sales, et cetera, in place so that they can be successful. There's another one that does not have a COO, never had a COO, and now they have been looking for one. We actually hired one a month ago, and he starts next week. But it's the same kind of process, onboarding, getting that person up to speed, and getting them set up to support that visionary CEO.
We probably should back up just a little bit for our listeners who may not know what a COO is. Forrest, maybe that would be a good example, because in my mind, there are probably many businesses that have people or one person doing COO things, but they just don't know that's a job title.
Yeah. So from my perspective, and I think it's different for other organizations, especially when you get into really, really large, $100 million, $200 million organizations, that may be different. But in the smaller scale, the, $2 million to $50 million, maybe $100 million size, getting up to that point, the COO is the second in command. So you've got a CEO, then you've got a CEO or COO, and then the leadership team, i.e. marketing, sales, operations, finance, they all report to that COO. So that chief operating officer is the glue that holds the business together so that the CEO can live his best life. There's lots of examples. You talk about Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Steve Wozniak was that right hand, that COO. You talk about Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger was that COO type person. And so there's just a whole bunch of examples in history where that mix works to scale a business.
And I can imagine, Forrest, you mentioned you've got three that you're currently working with. Obviously, you've worked with many in the past. Outside of maybe, as they're growing and scaling, kind of starting to identify that they maybe need that role, what are some of the common problems that you're kind of experiencing or trying to solve when you come into a business that, you deem as somebody who you can start to help out?
Yeah, I'll tell you the three that I'm working with don't have a sales problem. They do not have a revenue problem. And that's where it starts, getting troublesome because they've got the revenue. They just don't know how to deliver. So all three of these companies I'm working with have operational challenges and finance challenges. And not from a cash flow standpoint, it's how to manage the finances, how to get the reports, how to get, consistent financial reports so they can make good decisions. A lot of these companies have been successful brute force. And so when I look at them, they're growing, they're scaling, they're adding people, but you go and ask 10 people on their team what their job role is, and they can't answer it. They don't know what their role is. And so having a clear picture, to have a clear vision so that everybody understands where the business is going. If I could boil it down to anything, that's probably the biggest thing, is just getting everybody on the same page so that the whole team is rowing in the right direction.
Do you tend to find yourself working with that main leadership team to help kind of dive in and get all of these responsibilities laid out?
Yes. Yeah. In the EOS world, we call that the accountability chart rather than the organizational chart. And there really is a difference. I mean, an accountability chart isn't focused on titles or hierarchy. It's really more about what are you accountable for and who are you accountable to? And so building out that accountability chart is absolutely crucial. Using the leadership team to get the right people in the right seat so that then the company knows where it needs to go. But also identifying seats that need to be filled, because that going through that process of building that accountability chart, you end up finding gaps. One of my clients, first couple of weeks in, they say, "Hey, we need to hire somebody." I'm like, "Well, why do you need to hire somebody?" I'm like, "Well, we got this problem." I'm like, "Okay, what's the problem?" And so they described it, and I said, "Well, wait a minute, hold on a second. Who's supposed to be doing that?" "Well, I don't know." Well, we go in and dig and find out that they don't need to hire anybody. They need to make sure everybody understands what their role is and make sure everybody's staying in their lane. Once we got that squared away, there was no reason to hire somebody. So I find a lot of these smaller companies, especially as they're scaling fast, they're hiring people to solve problems rather than getting to the root of the problem.
Do you see a lot of kind of in that scaling aspect, right? Like sometimes do I need to hire somebody or do I need to realign roles and skills? Or you mentioned, right, the right people on the right seat of the bus.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? I mean, how are you, maybe you're doing the evaluation of those things, maybe you're relying on others. What does that typically look like? If somebody who, I can also say to some of the businesses I work with are in that kind of major growth mode, and luckily, sales might not be a problem, but then they're like, "Oh, well, we've got so-and-so that did this and so-and-so did this, and we don't know where to hire, outsource, move, so what does that kind of look like for you from an outside perspective coming in?"
Yeah, it's different for every company, but the challenge is to design the accountability chart for what you need in the next 12 months, not what you're doing today, but also design the accountability chart around what the seed is and not the person. So one of the big challenges with companies, especially as they've been going for, 5-10 years, and then all of a sudden they're hyper growing, is they've got Sally, who's always done this one job, but she doesn't do it well. But she's been there for the whole time. She was maybe the first or second employee. And so realigning the company for the seats to where the company needs to grow, not taking into account who's sitting in those seats currently, and then you figure out where the seats play out. Unfortunately, sometimes people end up not having a seat on the bus, and you got to find another bus for them. And, there's a whole nother way to deal with that. But I think the big issue is making sure that the organization is structured for how you need to operate in the next 12 months, not how you've been operating in the last 12 months.
So, Forrest, I don't think we've gotten into this yet, but I know we've talked previously. So what have you found, I guess, over your vast career? What are the experiences that you've had that really helped you be able to identify these things for businesses and kind of lean into that? Because I know you kind of have a extensive history.
Yeah, EOS is one of the best operating systems that I've found out there. There's a lot of them. There's Pinnacle Guides, there's Boss Up, there's Scaling Up. There's a lot of different operating systems. At the end of the day, choosing an operating system for a business is the most important thing. Choose that operating system and choose a language that you're going to use. Choose the right terminology. or not the right terminology, choose the consistent terminology. That's the biggest thing, because in any business that I've worked in, language is a problem, especially when you got, 10, 15, 20 employees. If everybody's not speaking the same language, they're not calling the same product the same thing, they're not calling the same, solution the same thing, people, it's hard to communicate. It's hard to make sure everybody is aligned with where the company's going. So EOS is the one that I've chosen to align with. And, there's a whole framework of EOS implementers that come into a business and help them implement EOS. That is not my forte. I'm an integrator, so I work inside the business versus outside the business. But choosing a framework and sticking to that language and getting that language to be consistent from marketing all the way to service delivery, that is one of the biggest things that I've seen as an advantage.
Yeah, I found, at least even an experience of my own business and just seeing the other businesses, without a system, like things get hairy fast.
Yes.
And they like grow legs and they just do whatever they want to do. And I feel like this is like the biggest chore, one of the biggest chores of running a business, is having the discipline to pick one and stick to it and be serious about it.
Right. And it not be the flavor of the month. I mean, the first company I worked with before we found EOS, it was a different book every 2 months. And then it was a different thing every 2 months. And we finally found EOS and landed on that. And then it was like, this is what we're going to do. We may add a new sales, program. We may add a new finance program, whatever, but this is the base operating system that you're either going to be Mac or Windows. You got to choose one. You can't try to do both. Right. Yeah.
Grant, I know you have a ton of experience with, and we've talked about it a lot, but just general processes and procedures. And I'm sure that this flows deeply into what you work with for us, but it can be as simple as the naming convention of files in your system, and not using the same language, and then you can't navigate things.
I just had this come up in a meeting I had with a client. I meet with them once a month, and we were talking about OneDrive versus Dropbox and the naming convention, and it's amazing. It's just simple consistency can make such a big difference. And they had an employee in a new role, and he couldn't understand the file structure and the naming structure that the previous person had used because there was no consistency. So 100%.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of that too, like there is a lot, right? Like it's, especially from the marketing perspective, like if it's naming conventions, if it's file structures, if it's what marketing calls it versus maybe what the sales team is looking for. Like sometimes there's some disconnects there.
Yeah.
Where things are held, what, who also owns that gate to potentially that content, right? Like sometimes, sales is like, hey, we want to go create something. And you're like, you shouldn't do that. That should not be your role.
Right.
Please don't do that. Please don't do that. But yeah, I think one of the things I definitely have seen it on the marketing side is, that consistency. And I'm curious from your perspective, Forrest, like the other thing I've also seen is a lot of times companies will say the magic 3 letters of SOP. Let me just put together a standard operating procedure for this, or let me write down in this 65-page manual exactly how I get from point A to point B. And I think a lot of times folks struggle because one, they don't have a consistency of even the format of an SOP between one department to another. And number two is they just don't have maybe the skill set to do it, or how they want to articulate how to do something that's different. So what I think that's a very common thing I hear from folks. So Forrest, I'm curious from your perspective, like when it comes to standard operating procedures and these magical, this is how we do things, like what has been your experience, and any tips or tricks on that side that you've that you've been able to implement for folks?
Keep it simple, stupid. That's the biggest advice I can give. And again, I had a client I was working with this week, same thing. We were talking about a process, and I said, where is that process? Oh, it's in OneDrive. All right, where in OneDrive? Oh, it's such. I said, how many pages is that process? Oh, it's like 30. I'm like, when was the last time you looked at it? I don't know, 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. You got to simplify. And I had one of the visionaries I work for, he had a buddy that owns Popeye's Chicken. And, Popeye's fast food, right? You go into the kitchen in Popeye's fast food, and there's a flow chart of a proven process for how to put a chicken sandwich together. That's the kind of mindset that you've got to have, is what is the What are the 20% of things that you can do that get 80% of the results? And how do you keep it simple and high level? I worked with a company where before we found EOS, we had created the proven process. It was pages and pages and pages and pages, and nobody ever looked at it. Well, if you can't teach it, if you can't get consistency, what's the use in having it? You look at football coaches, and those football coaches, they don't have 700 plays and 700 playbooks. They got 5 or 6, and they just rotate them around, and they train on them, and they know that these people know how to do this. Inside and out. You can blindfold them and they know where they're supposed to be. That's the kind of mindset you got to have, is not document everything, but document the major steps that get you the major results.
We've had some coverage on this, and I think I want to put a big warning out there to folks, like, think twice before you make that 30-page, operating procedure, because probably 9 out of 10 people will open that up and go, ugh, and not ever look at it.
Right.
But Grant and I have talked about, there are so many tools now to create very simple and effective, procedures for how your business runs. Versions of video, different, other softwares that show you navigating on screens. We've even talked like out in the, more of the blue collar trades out in the field, utilizing video,
right?
Utilizing, you see all these different tech stacks with iPads that show you the to-do list. Mm-hmm. And I agree with Forrest. That's a really good take on, is there a very simple way we can show this that gets it 80%, because we're always going to have variables? That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. The one thing I did want to talk about too was what I found so interesting when I met you, Forrest, is that I think our brains jive well together, because you showed me kind of a workflow, of kind of a start to finish, from marketing to sales to delivery of the service or product to the accounting. I think it's one of those things I kind of want to get your take. It's a 2-part question, but do you think businesses should be maintaining some high-level workflow like that at every stage of their existence, from the day they open until the end? And how important do you think that is for just that sustainability of that business as they scale?
Yes. So people, especially visionaries and especially people who are starting up business and scaling businesses, things grow so fast that it becomes unsustainable for people to even understand. So Wednesday, for example, I was working with a client and working with their finance team, just documenting the flow of cash and bank accounts and the, interweaving between 4 different entities, and which company loans which company money, and how does that cash flow. You've got to have documentation. The company I work for is a telecom, SaaS, and a telecom agency. So it had 3 businesses that generated revenue, but it had 5 entities in total. I literally had a map on my dry erase board in my office, kind of like I showed you, same program, that basically said, this goes to this, this goes to this, it goes to this, because I would have people come in my office and say, hey, I'm trying to solve this problem. How does this work? I'm like, well, let's look at the map. Let's see what we documented and how this goes. And yes, absolutely. Not only business entity, but also what I showed you was application flow. People do not, every business I've got into in the last 6 months, they don't know what applications they're using or what applications their people are using. And you ask 5 people what they're using, and they're using 5 different subscriptions for the same thing. And so we put it in a map. That's one of the first things I do with my clients, is put an application map. And it's like, holy cow, we've got swivel chairing. We've got multiple steps. Why isn't QuickBooks integrated with the billing system? Why isn't QuickBooks integrated with the credit card system? There's just so many manual steps that people just get tunnel vision in their seat, and they just don't understand the cause and effect. So you really have to have a map. You use Google Maps to get to a store you've never been to. Why don't you have a map for your business? So yeah, you're speaking my language. That's a soapbox for me.
Well, I've looked at that before, and when you do that zoom out, a lot of times, I'm sure you've experienced this too, there's a handful of items you're just like, all right, let's just get rid of these because they serve no purpose right now, or they're redundant, or someone's wasting a bunch of time on it, or hey, this system that we bought 5 years ago now has this feature which replaces this other one, because then in the world now, you got to have a subscription for this, an app for that, and this and that. And now they're starting to grow and have all the features in one, potentially, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, that is my language. I love educating people on how the beauty of QuickBooks is that if you're using popular other platforms from a project management or billing or whatever system, everything can talk to each other. And that's going to get you A, cleaner and more accurate data.
Right.
And B, more real-time data, because it's happening live with that integration.
Yeah.
And that's so helpful, rather than saying, okay, we got to wait until, we close the books, on April 19th or April 18th, Friday, April 18th, we got the books closed. Now we can go look at what happened in March. Well, if you have all these integrations going, you can start looking at some data live,
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the things I've had at the last couple of companies I've worked for full time, is we built out dashboards that integrated with QuickBooks, integrated with the proprietary billing platform, integrated with HubSpot, and you can layer all those visuals to see what's going on in the business real time. It was actually one of the first projects I had for a couple of companies that I worked. He wanted a dashboard on his phone where he could be sitting in an airport and be able to look and see the health of the business at any point in time. And he drilled that over and over again. That's what I want. That's what I want. But if you use applications like you're talking about with QuickBooks, you can do all that.
I was going to ask, just for the listeners, because, some of them may have thought about a CEO or COO. Some of them have no clue how they could facilitate that in their business. What do you see as kind of the ideal point and size of the business where it makes sense for that CEO of that business or that owner of that business to start considering, hey, let me get this right-hand man or woman like we're seeing with these other CEOs? I'm sure it's not always a revenue number, and it's probably more of a complexity number, but I'd like to hear your take on that.
Yeah, it's definitely not a solid revenue number, because I got one that's the $2 million business, and they needed one because they're hockey stick scaling. They're going to be at 5 million probably this year. So it's not strictly based off of revenue. It is based off of how quickly they're scaling and the complexity of the business. And at some point, one of the companies is probably going to have a $50 million business. Just it's time for the owner to actually start enjoying life. Enjoy your boat, enjoy your airplane, enjoy whatever. And they can afford it, and they need to have that second in command to actually run the business. So it's a hard answer to say. I wish it was easier to say, but it's not exactly revenue. Complexity definitely is part of it, but then it's also the CEO has to be at a point where they're ready to relinquish control and relinquish, the operating of the business. They've got to be at a point where they're ready to do that. And that's one of the reasons the fractional space is so cool, because, some of these companies just can't afford, a salary of a full-time COO, but they could afford a fractional one. At part-time, I can get a lot more done than a full-time person that doesn't have the experience. So,
right.
I think Forrest, a big piece of this is maybe sometimes an owner or the business leaders are identified like, maybe they need a fractional COO, and maybe they, should start implementing EOS, or, hey, we know we've got a problem with just, systematically how the business is running, or just from an operations standpoint. And you mentioned, sometimes it's efficiency, sometimes it's changing of roles, or teaching people a new way of doing things. That's easier said than done. And I'm curious from your perspective, like, there's a lot of change management that gets incorporated into this. And like, you have to deal with a lot of, people and the emotional impact of that. And it's the, it's not you, it's, it's a skill
not me,
thing.
It's you, right?
Right. So maybe, from your perspective, like maybe share a bit stories or just advice, like how have you seen that successfully, that change management happening in a way that, is not always gonna be positive, but gets to the most positive outcome that you can.
Yeah, I think the best way to do it is to listen, especially if you're a COO coming into a business, whether you're fractional or full time. Is you can't come in with a sledgehammer and start making changes. The last company, the landscaping company I worked at, first thing I did was I rode around with all the managers one at a time and spent a whole day with them. And all I did was ask questions. And, I was labeled as a spy. I was labeled as a hatchet man. I was labeled as a lot of different things during that process. But what I position myself to do is to be an obstacle remover. And so as a COO, you have to remove obstacles. That's the position you've got to be in. It's not about ego. It's not about you enforcing your way of doing business. It's about removing obstacles. And, one of the guys I had an opportunity to work with, he was really frustrated. He was in a different branch, and so he wasn't connected to the business per se in a daily way. And, I walked into emails just like daggers and flaming arrows flying back and forth between two cities via email. And I went and spent the day with him and figured out this guy, all he needed was a personal assistant. He needed a personal assistant. Seriously, all he needed was a personal assistant, and he needed to come to a meeting once a week at the office. Once we did those two things, the problems went away. And so it's the first inclination would be, oh, this guy's horrible. I just saw his email. You need to fire him. Let's get rid of him tomorrow. Well, that's not always the issue. You need to get to the root cause of the issue. And so spending time with him and leveraging a virtual assistant and having him in a meeting once a week solve the problem. So
yeah, that's an easy one. With how easy it is to get good virtual assistants these days, there's so many options.
Yeah.
That's a good hack right there. I did kind of want to talk about too, a lot of CEOs are wearing the COO hat, but I imagine a lot of CEOs are horrible COOs. What's your take there?
I wouldn't imagine that. I would say that I'd say
we'll
that
stop recording right there.
Yeah, no. I'd say the majority of CEOs are doing the best they can.
Yeah,
there are a limited number of CEOs that I would say can be the COO and be effective. The problem is now what are we giving up as a company by them wasting their time in the COO seat when they could be growing the company at a whole different level? So yes, there are absolutely CEOs that can do the COO role, but most of them, they're not detail oriented. They're not, they don't want to, that flow chart, the diagram that you and I were talking, they aren't going to do that. They don't even want to do that. They don't want to think about that. They love it when they see it and they're like, yeah, that's cool. Keep doing that. You're doing a great job. But they don't want any part of that. That is not their jam. So.
Yeah. Me and Grant have talked about this a lot. There's a little bit of left brain, right brain, right? Like this, and that's the beauty of a great CEO is when they are freed up to use their whatever side of their brain is that visionary and is that moving the business forward, and they're not drugged down by the day-to-day operations. And there are people out there that is their jam, like you said. That is they look at that and they go, I want to build this system, I want to maintain this system. And that it's got to be a huge relief when it's successfully laid out for those CEOs, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the other things I do is I coach integrators and COOs. And so I've got 4 different COOs that I coach on a monthly basis. And I had my first call with one today. She's newly in the role. She's owned businesses in the past. And we talked for 90 minutes. At the end of the call, she started crying. And this is, she's older than I am. So she's not like a young, inexperienced person. And she was like, I'm sorry, I'm just emotional. I was like, are you all right? And she was like, I figured out what I'm supposed to do with my life. I've been looking for what I'm supposed to do. And this is it. I love the details. I love the processes. I love the structure. I love the accountability chart, and it's neat that left brain, right brain, she finally figured out. And I politely tell people that there are a lot of closet integrators out there. There are people who are closet COOs and they just don't know it. And then once they've been seen it and seen what it's possible, they're like, oh, these are my people. This is who I am. So
I love that. I think I'm a closet CEO dressed as a COO. Like, my business and what we do is COO all over it, right? Just to find a portion of it. But like, I think the day I get to where that's not what I do every day, sounds great because like it scratches that itch that I didn't know I was supposed to have.
Right.
Because sometimes you can get channeled into the way you should operate based on your experience or what your job was or what you went to school for. And that's not always the same, for everybody. So that's a really interesting story to hear that. I think the other thing too we wanted to know is that I guess if someone's listening to this and they've, felt like, okay, this makes sense. I probably should think about either a platform in which to nail the operations of the business, or looking at getting some type of COO. What would you recommend they do in terms of just like starting out? Because I'm sure they're like, do I need to hire somebody? Do I need to get a consultant? What should I do next?
Yeah. I would say the first thing to do is to talk to a fractional COO to learn what they do. And you could go to my website. I've got some information on there. It's derrconsulting.com. And definitely, if I can't help you, I'm going to steer you to somebody that can, because that is my goal is to connect CEOs and visionaries with COOs. And I've got a pretty good network of those. But research what that's about, because the fractional space, I know you're in it. I'm in it. Grant, you're in it. It's just there's not a lot of people that understand it still. That you can pay a higher hourly rate, but pay a premium to get the level of service that you don't have to pay a full-time salary and benefits. So educate yourself on what a fractional COO can do, because it might be you need a fractional COO and then graduate and grow into a COO.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Grant, I'm sure you have some feedback on this, but you're able to get so much expertise, and you'd be shocked at how much can get done with that fractional person. And like you said, it can even tee your business up for having the methodology and the platform for that hire one day.
Right.
Yeah, no, and from my perspective, just quickly on the marketing side, yeah, I mean, I absolutely love, I didn't realize I had my US pen here. But no, I absolutely love coming to that situations from a marketer standpoint, selfishly, that they're either getting onto EOS, they're in EOS, or they have that kind of system in place, because marketing very much follows. Like, it's very easy to put marketing in an EOS system, say we're going to do things at a quarterly standpoint, and so if there's something we need to get done, like it's great.
Let me ask you this: Do you have tears in your eyes when you go in and meet with a client and they show you their VTO?
I get so excited. And when they got the like marketing messaging, or like my
they got the target market,
the
demographics,
the target market, and the vision statement, and I'm like, oh, okay, we can move right into like, let's go. Oh, it's fantastic. And sometimes they don't, or sometimes it's up here and they need somebody to pull that out. But that I get real excited, because I'm like, oh, we're going to go fast, and you have no idea what's about to happen. So yes, I do get excited.
But that goes to the concept of having an organized business and having it dialed in and structured and know where you're going. And that's one of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is if you have an organized business, if you have an operating system, if you have a VTO or vision traction organizer where you have the 5-year plan, the 10-year plan, the 3-year plan, the 1-year picture, all that together, your business is worth more money. It absolutely is worth more money, because the business is not dependent on the owner. One of the businesses I worked in, the telecom company, COVID happened, owner got COVID. He was in the hospital for, I think, 2 months, was out of commission for probably 4 or 5 months. Business didn't miss a beat. Not that he didn't add value to the business, but we had EOS in place. We had all the structure in place. I was in place as the integrator. Sure, it hurt us from the standpoint of long-term growth, because he wasn't out there building relationships, but nobody noticed that the business was, nobody noticed any difference in the business. The business was not in trouble. It was because we had the processes and procedures in place.
I mean, that absolutely drives the valuation up when you can look at, hey, here's the map of how this business works and who's responsible for what. Because, okay, transition, what if somebody quits? Boom, here's the accountability chart and what they handled. Here's how you replace it. Versus you're looking at the equally, the same type of business that just has their P&L listed on, and you're like, oh, I don't know how this business works. That's a really good point. And we've talked about, we actually talked with Chris. He was on a couple episodes ago, and we talked about generating value in a business, and this is one big one. Absolutely.
Well, Forrest, Tyler indicated this, and 100%, I want to echo it here at the end, what he said at the beginning, but we are super appreciative of you hopping on and sharing some knowledge today. I think, I was even taking some notes on some things that you were saying, and I just want to kind of leave it here in terms of, folks who are looking for this service, or how, again, can they find you, and anything else, any big nuggets or last pieces of advice you want to offer up that, maybe we didn't cover today that you're like, gotta get that in there.
definitely find me on my website, derrconsulting.com. I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. I don't think there's any other Forrest Derrs out there. As long as you put a space in there, you'll find me pretty easily. But, I think the biggest thing I would say, and then this was advice that I got from one of my visionaries, is go before you're ready. You got to just start. And I've talked to so many people that it's paralysis by analysis, and they want to get everything perfect before they launch. And you will never launch if you try to wait to get it perfect. So just get started.
Well, thanks again, Forrest. And thanks again, everybody, for joining the NextGen Strategies podcast. We have a lot more awesome episodes coming up here soon. So continue to subscribe, like, share, tell your friends, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thanks again for joining us today on the NextGen Strategies podcast.
Be sure to follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you really enjoyed it, give us a share on any of your favorite social media channels.
And don't forget to leave us a review.